The sister who turned grief into light. The house in Maryland is still dark at 4:47 a.m. when Eunice Kennedy Shriver sits down at her desk, the only light coming from the lamp she has just switched on, casting a warm amber glow across the papers that cover every available surface. Outside, the world is suspended in that peculiar stillness that exists between night and morning, when the birds have not yet begun their singing and the traffic has not yet started its daily grinding forward. She is 63 years old on this morning in 1984, though she carries herself with the kind of energy that suggests someone decades younger, or perhaps someone who has never allowed herself the luxury of rest. Her dark hair is pulled back efficiently. She wears reading glasses that sit low on her nose. Her hands, elegant but marked by years of constant work, move across documents with practiced precision. The papers on her desk are plans for the next Special Olympics World Games. Logistics, budgets, volunteer coordination, athlete transportation, medical support, media outreach. Each document represents dozens of decisions, hundreds of phone calls, thousands of hours of work by people across the globe who have joined her mission. But the ultimate responsibility, the weight of ensuring that everything works, that these athletes get their moment to shine, that weight rests on her shoulders. And she has carried it for so long now that she sometimes forgets what it felt like before. On the wall above her desk hangs a photograph from the first Special Olympics Games in 1968 at Soldier Field in Chicago. In it, young athletes with intellectual disabilities are running, their faces radiant with joy and effort, experiencing perhaps for the first time in their lives what it means to be celebrated rather than hidden, to be seen as capable rather than dismissed as burdens. Eunice stands at the edge of the photograph, watching these athletes. And if you look closely at her expression, you can see something beyond pride or satisfaction. You can see vindication, redemption, the fierce satisfaction of someone who has transformed personal grief into global change. But you can also see exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that comes from decades of relentless work, from carrying not just her own burdens, but the hopes of millions of people who have been told their entire lives that they do not matter. Eunice has made them matter. She has forced the world to see what it had been determined to ignore. And the cost of that forcing, the endless travel, the constant fundraising, the political battles, the sacrifice of so much personal life to this mission, that cost is written in the lines around her eyes, in the tension she carries in her shoulders, even in these quiet pre-dawn moments. She picks up her pen. She begins to write notes in the margins of a document. The clock ticks quietly on the wall. Outside, the sky is beginning to lighten, the first pale hints of dawn touching the edges of darkness. And Eunice Kennedy Shriver continues the work that has defined her adult life, the work she will continue until the day she dies, the work of honoring her sister Rosemary by ensuring that no other person with intellectual disabilities will be invisible, forgotten, or destroyed. The morning comes, the day begins, and Eunice, as always, is already working. To understand Eunice Kennedy Shriver, you must first understand that she was shaped by a wound she could not prevent, and spent her entire life trying to heal in others what she could not heal in her own family. That wound was Rosemary, her older sister, born in 1918, just 3 years before Eunice, the sister who struggled with intellectual disabilities in a family that could not tolerate imperfection. Eunice was close to Rosemary in ways that some of her other siblings were not. She saw past the limitations to the person beneath. Someone who laughed, who felt, who wanted to be included and loved. Eunice understood that Rosemary was not broken or defective, but simply different, that she needed support and patience rather than the harsh judgment and impossible expectations that their father imposed. As children, Eunice would help Rosemary with tasks that were difficult for her. She would include her in games even when Rosemary struggled to keep up. She developed early a protective instinct toward her older sister, a sense that someone needed to see Rosemary's humanity when the rest of the family was so focused on achievement and perfection. But in 1941, when Eunice was 20 years old, something happened that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Their father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., authorized a prefrontal lobotomy to be performed on Rosemary. He told no one in advance, not Rose, not the other children. He simply arranged it, believing that this experimental surgery would calm Rosemary, would make her more manageable, would solve the problem of her existence. The surgery was catastrophic. It destroyed Rosemary's capacity for independent function, left her requiring institutional care for the rest of her life, erased the person she had been, and replaced her with someone who could barely speak, who could no longer recognize her own siblings, who had been lobotomized into a kind of living death. When Eunice learned what had been done, and it took time for the full truth to emerge, as Joseph Sr. kept the details hidden, she was devastated. The sister she had tried to protect had been destroyed by their own father, and Eunice had been powerless to stop it. This powerlessness, this failure to protect Rosemary, became the defining wound of Eunice's life. But unlike some people who respond to trauma by retreating, by becoming cautious or self-protective, Eunice responded by becoming fierce. If she could not save Rosemary, she would save others. If she could not undo what had been done, she would prevent it from happening again. If she could not give Rosemary back her voice, she would give voice to millions of others who had been silenced by a society that considered intellectual disability shameful and people with such disabilities disposable. This was not theoretical commitment or abstract compassion. This was personal. This was grief transformed into mission, powerlessness transformed into action, trauma transformed into a life's work that would eventually reshape global attitudes toward disability. Eunice attended Stanford University, then worked for the U.S. State Department, and later for the Justice Department. But her real education came not from classes or career advancement, but from the time she spent visiting institutions where people with intellectual disabilities were warehoused. And warehoused is the only accurate word for how society treated these individuals in the 1940s and 1950s. She would visit these places and see conditions that were appalling: overcrowding, understaffing, lack of stimulation or dignity. People treated as less than human simply because they learned differently or processed information at different speeds. She saw children locked in rooms with no toys, no education, no hope. She saw adults who had been institutionalized as children and had never been given a chance to develop their potential because no one believed they had any potential worth developing. And she became angry. Not the performative anger of someone posturing for effect, but the deep, burning anger of someone who has witnessed profound injustice and cannot unsee it. Eunice was privileged. She had wealth, connections, the Kennedy name. She could have simply written checks to disability charities and considered her obligation fulfilled. But that was not who she was. She began to educate herself systematically about intellectual disabilities, the causes, the range of abilities, the research on what people with such disabilities could achieve when given appropriate support. She read medical journals, consulted with doctors and educators, visited programs in different countries that were experimenting with new approaches. What she learned was that the conventional wisdom about intellectual disability was largely wrong. People with intellectual disabilities were not incapable of learning or contributing. They simply learned differently and at different paces. Given appropriate support, many could live semi-independent or fully independent lives, could work, could participate meaningfully in their communities. The limitations that society saw as inherent were often limitations that society itself had imposed through low expectations and lack of opportunity. This knowledge fueled Eunice's growing conviction that something needed to change fundamentally. Not just improved institutions, but a complete transformation of how society viewed and treated people with intellectual disabilities. But Eunice was not simply a disability rights advocate. She was also a Kennedy daughter, and that meant carrying the weight of family expectation, even as she tried to pursue her own mission. Joseph Kennedy Sr. did not understand or particularly value Eunice's work with people with disabilities. He wanted his daughters to marry well, produce grandchildren, support their brothers' political careers. Eunice's intense focus on disability rights seemed to him like a distraction from what mattered: Kennedy power, Kennedy political ascendancy. Rose Kennedy was similarly unsupportive. Rose's approach to Rosemary's tragedy had been to hide it, to pretend it had not happened, to maintain the fiction that the Kennedy family was perfect and that mentioning Rosemary's situation was somehow disloyal. Eunice's determination to speak publicly about intellectual disability, to acknowledge that her own sister had been disabled, went against everything Rose believed about maintaining family image. But Eunice persisted. When her brother Jack became president, she worked within the Kennedy administration to focus attention on intellectual disability, successfully advocating for the creation of the President's Panel on Mental Retardation, which would eventually lead to significant policy changes. She used her access to power not for personal gain, but to advance her cause, leveraging the Kennedy political machinery for purposes her father had never intended. And yet, there was always tension between Eunice's mission and her family role. She was expected to appear at political events for her brothers, to support Jack's presidency, and later Bobby's Senate career and presidential campaign. She was expected to be available for family gatherings, to maintain the Kennedy sister role, even as she was trying to build something entirely separate from family politics. The assassinations of Jack in 1963 and Bobby in 1968 devastated her, as they devastated all the siblings. But for Eunice, these losses also meant something else. They meant that the family's focus, which had always been on the Kennedy brothers' political futures, could no longer be sustained in quite the same way. With Jack and Bobby gone, with Ted damaged by Chappaquiddick, the Kennedy political dynasty was wounded. And in that wounding, there was perhaps more space for Eunice to pursue her own vision without constant pressure to subordinate it to family political ambitions. In 1962, Eunice began an experiment in her own backyard in Maryland. She invited children with intellectual disabilities to attend a summer day camp, Camp Shriver, where they could swim, play sports, engage in activities that most summer camps would not accept them for. The idea was simple: give these kids a chance to be kids, to experience joy and physical activity and social connection rather than being locked away or treated as burdens. The response was transformative. The children thrived. They learned to swim, to play games, to interact with each other and with volunteers in ways that many people had assumed they were incapable of. Parents who had been told their children would never amount to anything watched as those same children laughed, competed, achieved small victories that felt enormous. But more importantly, Eunice saw something in these children that crystallized everything she had been working toward. She saw that when given opportunity and support, people with intellectual disabilities could experience the same joy in physical achievement that anyone else could. They could compete, could push themselves, could take pride in their efforts. The limitations were not in them. The limitations were in a society that refused to give them chances. This backyard camp was the seed of what would become the Special Olympics. Eunice began to envision something larger, not just a camp, but a genuine athletic movement, international in scope, that would give athletes with intellectual disabilities the opportunity to compete, to be celebrated, to be seen by the world as capable and worthy of attention. The idea was revolutionary. In the 1960s, most people with intellectual disabilities were hidden away in institutions or kept at home out of sight. The suggestion that they could be athletes, that they could compete in organized sports, that they deserved the same kind of recognition and celebration as Olympic athletes. This seemed absurd to many people, but Eunice had seen what was possible. She had witnessed the transformation that happened when these individuals were given opportunity, and she was determined to make the world see what she had seen. Creating the Special Olympics required everything Eunice had: her Kennedy connections, her tireless work ethic, her ability to fundraise and organize, her willingness to travel constantly and push through resistance. The first Special Olympics Games were held in July 1968 at Soldier Field in Chicago. 1,000 athletes with intellectual disabilities from 26 states and Canada competed in track and field and swimming events. The event was unprecedented. For many of the athletes, it was the first time they had ever competed in organized sports, the first time they had been celebrated for their abilities rather than defined by their limitations. For the families, it was validation, proof that their children, their siblings, their loved ones with intellectual disabilities were capable of achievement and worthy of recognition. But getting to that first games required battles at every level. Eunice had to convince the Kennedy Foundation to fund the initiative. She had to recruit volunteers, secure venues, develop rules and categories for competition that would be fair while accommodating different ability levels. She had to overcome the skepticism of people who questioned whether this was dignified, whether it was appropriate to have people with intellectual disabilities competing in public. Whether the whole enterprise was somehow exploitative. Eunice's response to these questions was fierce and uncompromising. These athletes were not being exploited. They were being celebrated. They were not objects of pity. They were competitors who trained and worked hard and deserved recognition for their efforts. The world needed to see them not as burdens or tragedies, but as people with capabilities, with dignity, with the same desires for achievement and recognition that drive all athletes. After the success of the first games, Eunice expanded relentlessly. Special Olympics grew to include more sports, more countries, more athletes. She traveled constantly to Asia, Europe, Africa, Latin America, establishing programs, training volunteers, advocating for policy changes that would support people with intellectual disabilities. The work was exhausting, all-consuming, but Eunice seemed incapable of stopping, driven by something deeper than mere commitment to a cause. But this relentless work came at enormous personal cost. Eunice had married Sergeant Shriver in 1953, a good man, accomplished in his own right, who shared many of her values and supported her work. They had 5 children together, but Eunice's dedication to Special Olympics meant that she was often absent, traveling for weeks at a time, focused on her mission in ways that left little room for the daily work of parenting or partnership. Her children grew up with a mother who was extraordinary but often unavailable, whose attention was divided between them and the millions of people with intellectual disabilities she was fighting for. This created complicated relationships, pride in her achievements mixed with resentment of her absences, understanding of the importance of her work mixed with the very human need for a mother who was simply present. Sergeant, too, had to navigate being married to someone whose mission took precedence over almost everything else. He was supportive, genuinely believed in the work she was doing, but the marriage was strained by Eunice's relentless pace and single-minded focus. They remained married, remained partners, but there was undoubtedly loneliness on both sides. The loneliness of living with someone whose heart is always partially elsewhere, whose thoughts are always returning to the work. Eunice's health suffered as well. She drove herself without mercy, working long hours, traveling constantly despite exhaustion, pushing through illness and fatigue because the work felt too important to pause. She developed health problems that were exacerbated by stress and overwork, but she rarely allowed herself adequate rest or recovery time. There were also emotional costs that were harder to quantify. Eunice carried the weight of Rosemary's tragedy every day. Every athlete she met, every program she established, every victory at Special Olympics Games. These were all haunted by the sister she could not save, the loss that could never be recovered, the guilt of having been powerless to prevent what her father had done. She also carried the weight of knowing that for all the progress Special Olympics represented, the fundamental problems persisted. People with intellectual disabilities still face discrimination, isolation, lack of opportunity. Institutions still existed where people were warehoused. The work was never finished, never would be finished in her lifetime. And this knowledge created a kind of desperate urgency in everything she did. By the time of Eunice's death in 2009 at age 88, Special Olympics had grown to include more than 3 million athletes from 170 countries. What had started in her backyard had become a global movement, fundamentally changing how society viewed and treated people with intellectual disabilities. She had forced the world to see what it had been determined to ignore, but her legacy extended beyond Special Olympics. Her advocacy work had contributed to policy changes that improved education, healthcare, and social services for people with intellectual disabilities. Her public acknowledgement of Rosemary's story, revealed finally in the 1960s after decades of family secrecy, had helped reduce stigma and encourage families to seek support rather than hide their loved ones with disabilities. Eunice had transformed personal tragedy into global impact. She had taken the grief and guilt of Rosemary's destruction and alchemized it into something that honored Rosemary's humanity more profoundly than any perfect family image could have. She had not saved her sister. That had been beyond her power. But she had saved millions of others from similar fates, from being hidden and dismissed and denied the opportunity to experience joy and achievement. The question of whether this was worth the personal cost, the strained family relationships, the neglected health, the relentless pace that left little room for rest or pleasure, is impossible to answer definitively. Eunice herself would likely have said yes without hesitation. The mission had been everything to her, more important than personal comfort or conventional family life, more important than her own well-being. But there was also tragedy in this. The tragedy of someone so driven by guilt and grief that they could not allow themselves to rest, could not forgive themselves for the powerlessness they had experienced as a young woman witnessing their sister's destruction. Eunice's legacy is profound and valuable, but it was built on the foundation of a wound that never fully healed. In her final years, when her health was failing and she could no longer maintain the relentless pace that had defined her adult life, Eunice spent time reflecting on what she had accomplished and what it had cost. She never expressed regret about the work. That was not who she was. But there was perhaps an acknowledgement that she had sacrificed much, that the single-minded focus that had made Special Olympics possible had also created distances that could not be fully bridged. Her relationship with Rosemary in those final years was tender and complicated. Rosemary outlived most of her siblings, dying in 2005 at age 86. Eunice visited her regularly, sitting with the sister who could no longer fully recognize her, talking to someone who could no longer fully respond. These visits were acts of devotion and penance, love and guilt intertwined in ways that could not be separated. What Eunice had done for millions of people with intellectual disabilities was extraordinary. She had given them visibility, opportunity, dignity, celebration. She had changed laws and policies and attitudes. She had created a movement that would continue long after her death, that would touch lives in ways she could never fully know. But what she could not do was change the past. She could not save Rosemary. She could not undo the lobotomy. She could not restore the sister she had tried to protect. And perhaps this is what drove her so relentlessly. Not just compassion for others, but the impossible hope that if she saved enough other people, if she built something big enough, it might somehow balance the scales, might somehow redeem the failure she had experienced as a 20-year-old woman who could not prevent her father from destroying her sister. The morning light still comes through windows in Maryland, though Eunice is no longer at her desk before dawn, no longer working through stacks of documents, no longer carrying the weight of a global movement on her shoulders. Special Olympics continues, grown beyond what she could have imagined in those early days in her backyard, touching lives across the world, giving athletes opportunities to compete and be celebrated. And somewhere in that continuing work, in every athlete who steps onto a field or a track or into a pool, in every family that watches their loved one compete and be recognized, in every volunteer who sees past disability to capability, somewhere in all of that is Eunice's spirit, still fierce, still determined, still insisting that the world see what it would prefer to ignore, still honoring her sister Rosemary through actions rather than words, still transforming grief into light. If you had witnessed what Eunice witnessed, if you had loved someone who was destroyed by your own family, if you had carried the guilt of being unable to prevent that destruction, what would you have done with that wound? Would you have had the strength to transform it into purpose? To spend your entire life fighting to prevent others from experiencing what your sister experienced? Or would the wound have consumed you, left you paralyzed by guilt and powerlessness? And when we look at people like Eunice, people who accomplish extraordinary things driven by trauma and grief, do we celebrate their achievements or mourn the cost of those achievements? Can both be true simultaneously? Eunice Kennedy Shriver built something beautiful from something broken, gave millions of people opportunities they would never have had otherwise, changed the world in measurable ways. But she also lived with a wound that never healed, drove herself without mercy, sacrificed much of her personal life to her mission. Was it worth it? Can such a question even be answered? What would you have done?